It was a stifling September afternoon, and the small town of Eldermore seemed engulfed in an eerie stillness. Lucas, a young literature teacher, decided to explore the abandoned library that everyone avoided. He'd always been fascinated by old places, especially those steeped in forgotten stories. But there was something different about this library, something that called to him in an inexplicable way. Lucas first heard about the place during a coffee break with his co-workers. They say no one goes in there and comes out the same, Sarah, his most superstitious colleague, had remarked. Curious but skeptical, he laughed it off. "It's just an old building," he replied, but the thought stuck with him for weeks. That afternoon, with the golden sunlight painting the streets, he decided to go. The library was at the northern edge of town, surrounded by gnarled trees that seemed to lean inward, as if trying to shield it. When he arrived, Lucas noticed its state of disrepair. The windows were coated with grime, and the wooden doors bore deep gashes like scars. Even so, the door gave way easily when he pushed it, groaning as if protesting his intrusion. The inside was even gloomier than he'd imagined. Toppled shelves, crumbling piles of books, and cobwebs in the dark corners. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and rotting wood. He swept his flashlight around, revealing details that seemed to whisper forgotten tales. Something caught his attention. A room at the back, its door slightly ajar. A faint glow leaked through the gap, as though a candle was burning. Even though no one was supposed to have been there for decades, Lucas hesitated, but his curiosity won out. As he entered the room, he was surprised to find intact shelves and an inexplicably clean atmosphere. In the center stood a massive wooden table holding a single open book. The pages were yellow, but the words written on them looked fresh. He ran his fingers over the title embossed on the cover, The Chronicles of Lucas Holloway. For a moment, his heart stopped. That was his name. Lucas froze, his trembling fingers brushing the book. It was impossible. His name was carved into the aged leather of the cover, the script almost seeming to pulse under his touch. With a heavy breath, he turned the first page, and what he read made him jerk back as though he'd been shocked. The lines described his childhood. Every detail was there. The yellow house with the white fence where he grew up, the days spent reading in a hidden attic, the bike accident that left a scar on his right eyebrow. Everything was written with unsettling precision, even feelings he'd never shared with anyone. "This can't be real," he whispered to himself, carefully flipping through the pages. His teenage years unfolded before him like a path in his memory. His first love, the heartbreak that pushed him to write poetry for the first time. Even the fight with his best friend, a wound that had never fully healed. Then, something even more unsettling caught his attention. The text began describing the exact moment he had entered the library that afternoon. Lucas pushed open the door, its creak echoing like a warning. He caught the scent of old paper and rotting wood as he explored the interior. His footsteps led him to a room at the back, where a book awaited him. He slammed the book shut, the sound reverberating through the silent room. His mind was spinning in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. How was this possible? Who could have written his life? And how did they know what he was doing at that very moment? But something drew him back, against his instinct to flee. He opened the book again, flipping through the pages more quickly this time. What he read next made his stomach drop. The pages were starting to describe events that hadn't happened yet. After leaving the library, Lucas would hear his name whispered on the wind. He would run home but realize he was not alone. Something would follow him. Something awakened when he opened the book. Lucas snapped the book shut again, trying to steady his ragged breathing. This couldn't be real. Was it some kind of cruel prank? Maybe someone had known he would come and set this up to scare him. Then he heard it, a faint sound, like something dragging across the floor in the adjacent room. He whipped around, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Is someone there?" he called, his voice echoing. But the only response was silence. He decided to leave. He needed air, needed to think. As he reached the library's front door, something strange happened. The wind outside felt heavy, almost oppressive. And as he stepped onto the empty street, he heard his name clearly, whispered from every direction. Lucas. His heart raced. He sprinted home without looking back, but the feeling of being watched clung to him like a shadow. When he finally slammed the door shut behind him, he realized he had brought the book with him. He didn't remember picking it up. Lucas dropped the book onto the living room table and backed away, as if it might explode at any moment. The air inside his house felt stifling, every shadow on the walls deeper than it should have been. He turned on every light in the room, trying to convince himself he was safe. But the feeling wouldn't go away. He sat on the couch, staring at the book as if it were an enemy. The delicate handwriting on the cover seemed to pulse under the light, the engraved name almost alive. After what felt like hours, he finally gave in to his curiosity. "I just need to understand," he whispered to himself. With trembling hands, he opened the book again, this time determined to read everything he could. The pages now recounted events from the immediate future, describing his actions and thoughts with unsettling precision. Lucas would open the book, unable to resist the call of destiny. He would search for answers within the yellowed pages, but what he'd find would be far darker than he ever expected. He read aloud, his heart pounding. How did it know what he was going to do? It was as if the book was manipulating him, forcing him to follow exactly what was written. Then, something changed. The next pages were blank. The silence in his house deepened, growing almost tangible. He stood and walked to the window, needing to confirm that the world outside was still normal. The street was deserted, lit only by the lamppost in front of his house. And that's when he saw it, a figure. At first, it seemed like just a shadow, but as he focused his eyes, he noticed something strange. The figure had no defined edges, as if it were made of smoke or liquid darkness. It stood motionless, staring at his house. Lucas stepped back from the window, his heart racing. He glanced at the book on the table, as if expecting it to offer some kind of answer. Lucas felt the gaze of the presence outside, an overwhelming weight that invaded his mind. He knew he was being watched, that something had awakened when he opened the book. He tried to resist the urge to return to the library, but deep down, he knew it was his only way out. He blinked, stunned. The book was now describing what was happening at that exact moment. How could it know? How could it predict not only his actions, but his thoughts? He tried to shut the book again, but it resisted. The pages feeling unnaturally stiff, as though they wanted to remain open. The sound of the wind outside changed, becoming a low murmur, almost like incomprehensible words. Outside the window, the figure had moved closer. It now stood in the middle of the street, clearly visible under the lamplight. Lucas could see that it had a humanoid shape, but something about it was wrong. It was too tall, its limbs unnaturally long and disjointed. He wanted to scream, but his throat felt paralyzed. The book emitted a faint sound, like a whisper, and new words began to appear on the blank pages, written before his eyes. "Run, Lucas." Lucas stumbled backward from the table, knocking over a chair that screeched sharply across the floor. His eyes stayed glued to the words forming in the book, but the command seemed to echo in his mind. Run. He didn't know where to go. His house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a claustrophobic maze. Outside, the figure remained still, but something about it had changed. It seemed sharper, more solid. In a sudden, panicked move, Lucas turned off all the lights in the house, plunging the room into shadows. Maybe he thought if he couldn't see it, it couldn't see him either. But that fragile attempt at logic was shattered by a sound. 3 slow, deliberate knocks at the front door. Thump, thump, thump. The noise reverberated through the house, carrying a weight that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. Lucas froze, every muscle in his body on high alert, straining to hear anything beyond the oppressive silence that followed. Then, the book responded again. It gave off a faint glow, and more words appeared. Do not open the door. A fleeting wave of relief washed over him, but it was quickly overshadowed by rising dread. Not opening the door seemed obvious, but the fact that the book felt the need to warn him meant that whatever was out there was far worse than he'd imagined. The knocking resumed, louder now, more forceful, as if something or someone was trying to break the door down. Thump, thump, thump. Lucas held his breath and began to back away toward the hallway, his eyes never leaving the front door. Each step seemed to echo louder than the pounding itself. He reached the corridor leading to his bedroom, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. And then the sound stopped. For a moment, silence reigned once more. Lucas thought he could hear his own pulse pounding like a drumbeat. Then he noticed something that turned his terror into sheer, unbridled panic. The knocking wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was behind him. Thump, thump, thump. Spinning around suddenly, Lucas aimed his flashlight at the hallway. The beam of light quivered as he swept it through the darkness, but there was nothing. Yet the oppressive feeling of being watched only intensified. Without thinking, he bolted into the bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it behind him. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, his sweaty hands trembling so violently that he could barely hold onto the flashlight. Inside the room, something caught his eye, something that shouldn't have been there. The book. It was on the bed, lying open in the center. Lucas knew he had left it in the living room. He hadn't brought it with him, and yet there it was. Its pages spread wide as if waiting for him. With hesitant steps, he approached the bed. The words on the newly opened page looked as though they had been written moments ago. It's not outside. It's with you. Lucas froze, his body stiff with terror, as the air around him seemed to grow heavier, thicker. He didn't want to turn around, but a cold, crawling sensation crept up the back of his neck, as though something stood right behind him, waiting for him to notice. He stared at the book, his gaze locked on the ominous sentence. The words screamed at him in silence. It's not outside. It's with you. The tension in the room was unbearable. The weight of an unseen presence pressed down on him, suffocating, almost alive. His breaths came out ragged, each one carrying a chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. He knew he had to move, but the thought of turning around was paralyzing. What would he see? He could feel a faint warmth on his neck, like a breath that shouldn't be there. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Lucas made his move. He spun around, the flashlight trembling in his hands. The beam sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing. The room was empty. He took a shaky step backward, his heart still hammering in his chest as he tried to calm himself. But then he heard it, a faint sound, barely audible, like nails scratching against wood. It was coming from under the bed. This can't be happening, he whispered, his voice cracking as he fought the urge to scream. Driven by a mixture of desperation and an irresistible, morbid curiosity, he slowly crouched down, lowering the flashlight toward the floor. He pointed the beam into the darkness under the bed, revealing only shadows and dust. He let out a shaky sigh of relief, thinking he must be imagining things. But just as he began to stand, something cold and unyielding wrapped around his ankle. Lucas trembled, his chest heaving as if his body were on the verge of collapse. The knife in his hand felt both a comfort and a mockery. What good could it do against something so unnatural? The book lay on the table, its pages alive with shifting words, taunting him. Lucas hesitated, but the truth called to him. He knew that to understand, He had to keep reading, even if it meant facing what was to come. He gritted his teeth, his mind screaming at him to stop, to leave, to burn the damn thing and never look back. But the pull was undeniable, like gravity itself bending toward the book. With shaking hands, he reached out and turned the page. The new words were waiting for him. The knife in his hand would not save him. The kitchen was no refuge. Lucas was no longer alone. A chill ran down his spine, his every instinct screaming for him to turn around. But fear rooted him in place. His breaths came faster as he felt the air shift behind him, subtle yet undeniable, like the presence of something just beyond sight. Slowly, painfully, he turned his head. At first, he saw nothing but shadows. Then, as if stepping out of the darkness itself, the figure emerged. It was the same grotesque form he'd seen under the bed, its limbs too long, its face a shattered mosaic of horror. But now it stood fully upright, towering over him, its head tilted in a mockery of curiosity. The creature's hollow eyes locked onto his, and the edges of its mouth curled into that terrible, jagged grin. Lucas raised the knife, his arm trembling violently. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. The creature didn't move. It didn't need to. Instead, Lucas felt it, a pressure in his head, as if the thing was burrowing into his mind, peeling back layers of his thoughts and memories. The room spun and he stumbled, clutching the table for support. The book responded. Its pages flipped violently on their own, landing on a new set of words. "There is no escape, Lucas. You were chosen." "No!" Lucas screamed, slamming the book shut. The room seemed to recoil, the air itself vibrating with an otherworldly hum. The creature cocked its head further, as though amused by his defiance, summoning every ounce of strength he had left. Lucas lunged at the creature with the knife, but the blade sliced through nothing but air as the figure dissolved into smoke, reappearing a moment later across the room. A deep, guttural laugh echoed around him, though the creature's mouth never moved. And then the book began to glow. I won't read it," he said aloud, though his voice trembled with uncertainty. But curiosity was stronger. He had to know. Maybe the next pages would hold a solution, a way out of this nightmare. He turned the page, and what he saw left him breathless. Images began to appear in the book, like photographs drawn with unnerving precision. The first showed his house, the exact view of the front that night, with the lights on and the shadows cast by the street lamp. The second image was of the hallway where he'd been minutes earlier, with a long shadow in the corner. He hadn't noticed it before, but now the thought paralyzed him. Something had been with him all along. The third image was of himself, sitting in the kitchen, staring at the book. He blinked, looking around, trying to understand how someone could possibly be sketching in real time. That's when he saw the last turned page. It was different. It didn't just have text or drawings. It was a reflection. The page gleamed like a mirror, but it didn't just show Lucas and the kitchen. Behind him, reflected in the paper, was the figure, clearer than ever, as if it were right at his shoulder. Lucas screamed, spinning around with the knife in his hand. But there was nothing there, and yet he felt it. The air behind him was heavy, almost alive, as if something occupied the space. The book began to glow again, but this time, the words weren't threats or descriptions. They felt like a command. Burn the book. Now, he hesitated. What if it was a trick? But before he could decide, the sound of pounding started again. Not at the front door, but at every window in the house. It was as if dozens of hands were demanding to get in, the wood and glass rattling under the impact. Lucas ran to the cabinet, grabbing a lighter he used for candles. He returned to the table, the sounds outside growing louder, mingling with faint, low murmurs that sounded like distant laughter. With a shaky motion, he held the flame to the edge of the book. The old leather began to curl, the pages twisting as the fire spread. The book seemed to scream, though not in sound. It was a cry he felt in his mind, as if something was being ripped from reality. The The pounding stopped. The house plunged into a deep, oppressive silence, as though all sound had been sucked away. Lucas stared at the ashes on the table, still trembling. But then he heard it, a soft voice, almost maternal, whispering behind him, "You made the wrong choice." Lucas froze at the sound, which seemed to slither directly into the center of his mind. Slowly, he turned, every muscle in his body paralyzed by fear. But contrary to his expectations, there was nothing behind him, just the darkness of the hallway leading to the living room. He let out a shaky breath, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination. After all, the book was destroyed. The ashes still smoldered on the table, and the air around him felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. But the relief didn't last. The voice returned, louder this time, closer. "It's not that simple." Lucas felt the ground beneath his feet grow unsteady, like he was standing on a boat adrift in rough waters. He gripped the table for balance, his heart pounding wildly. When he looked around, he noticed something strange. The kitchen had changed. The details seemed off. The cabinets were in the wrong places. The table appeared longer, and the windows were gone. He blinked, trying to make sense of it, but the shift was undeniable. He ran into the hallway, only to find something even more disturbing. The entire house had transformed. The walls were made of aged, dark wood, etched with hand-carved symbols. The hallway stretched farther than it should have, and at the far end, a faint, flickering light glowed, like a candle about to go out. "I'm dreaming," he muttered to himself, squeezing his eyes shut in an attempt to wake up. But when he opened them, the scene remained unchanged. And then he heard footsteps. The sound was slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the faint light at the end of the hallway. Each step echoed unnaturally, as though the sound was reverberating inside his mind rather than in the space around him. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. Silence fell once more, heavy and suffocating. Then, the light began to move, coming toward him. It wasn't a person carrying the candle, as he had imagined. Instead, the flame floated on its own, as if it had a will of its own. When the light was only a few feet away, it stopped. From the void behind it, a figure began to emerge. It was tall, taller than he remembered, with elongated, distorted limbs. But the face was his. Lucas froze in place. The creature bore his face, but it was warped with dark, empty eyes and a grotesquely twisted mouth stretched into a wide, malevolent grin. When it spoke, its voice was his own but fractured, as if something inhuman scratched at its edges. "You thought you could get rid of me." Lucas stumbled backward, tripping and falling onto his back. He tried to crawl away, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly. The creature continued to advance, slow and relentless, its every movement bending the shadows around it. "You burned the book," it continued, leaning over him. "But what's written cannot be undone. You didn't destroy your story, Lucas. You set it free." The flame floating around the creature began to grow, casting a pulsating, crimson light that filled the corridor. Lucas felt the heat, but also something far more piercing, pain deep within his soul, as if his very essence was being drained. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. Everything around him began to unravel. The walls crumbled into dust. The floor beneath him vanished into nothingness. He fell into the void, a silent scream trapped in his throat. And then everything went dark. Lucas awoke to absolute silence. There was no wind, no footsteps, no pounding. Not even the sound of his own breathing reached his ears. Slowly, he opened his eyes and found himself in a boundless, indeterminate space. The ground beneath him appeared liquid but supported his weight, while the horizon was nothing but endless mist. "Am I dead?" he asked aloud, though his voice sounded distorted, as if it wasn't entirely his own. Something answered, "Not yet." The voice was layered, an amalgamation of whispers and muffled screams. He spun around, desperate to locate the source, but there was only fog and darkness. You have crossed into where few ever tread, the space between destiny and choice. Lucas felt a shiver run down his spine. The space seemed alive, as though every molecule of air was watching him, waiting for him to act. He began walking, not knowing where to go, driven only by the urge to escape this place. As he moved, shapes started to emerge in the mist. They were vaguely human, translucent with blurred outlines. They seemed trapped, struggling against something invisible that held them in place. Lucas tried to approach one, but the moment he reached out his hand, it vanished, dissolving like smoke in the wind. "Who are you?" he shouted, but there was no response. As he pressed on, the mist began to thin, revealing something at the center of the void. It was a structure, a tower made of stacked books, their pages torn and covers scorched. The top of the pile seemed endless, disappearing into the nebulous sky above. Somehow, he knew he needed to get there. As he approached, a figure appeared at the base of the tower. It was the creature that had chased him before, but now it didn't seem as solid. Its body flickered like a wavering flame, and its face, Lucas's face, watched him with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. "Welcome to your story," the creature said. "Here lies everything you are worth and will be." Lucas stared at the tower, trying to make sense of it. "If it's my story, then I can change it," he said, trying to sound confident, though his voice betrayed the fear gnawing at him. The creature laughed, a distorted, echoing sound. "You burned the book, but not the ending. The ending was always the same." "I don't believe you," Lucas shot back, clenching his fists. "You don't have to believe me. Just watch." The creature pointed to the tower, and Lucas saw the pages begin to stir. They tore free from the books, swirling through the air and forming images around him. He saw flashes of his life, moments of joy, sorrow, and decisions he barely remembered making. But then the images shifted. He saw the library again, himself opening the book, and what happened afterward. Events he hadn't lived through yet. He saw himself trying to run, only to be pulled back, the cycle repeating endlessly. "You're not the writer, Lucas. You never were. You're just a character, trying to escape the script." Desperate, Lucas ran toward the tower. If his story was here, he had to destroy it for real. Maybe, just maybe, he could break free. Reaching the base of the tower, he felt the heat radiating from the books. He began pulling at the stacks, toppling volumes that fell in cascading waves around him. But the tower seemed infinite. For every book he removed, another appeared, materializing from nowhere. The creature appeared behind him, watching silently. "You'll never succeed, because to change the end, you must first accept the beginning." Lucas froze, panting heavily. He looked at the creature, then back at the tower. "The beginning," he muttered to himself. Something about those words resonated, like a lost memory trying to resurface. He stared at the creature, its words echoing in his mind. To change the end, you must accept the beginning. What did it mean? He felt there was something he wasn't seeing, something vital slipping through the fragmented edges of his memory. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice trembling with exhaustion and desperation. The creature smiled, that grotesque grin that seemed to tear across his distorted face. It took a step forward, and Lucas felt an overwhelming pressure in the air, as if its presence were sucking all the energy from the space around him. "Have you never wondered why you went to the library?" Lucas blinked, confused. He clearly remembered his curiosity, the nearly uncontrollable urge to explore that place. But now, under the weight of the creature's words, that memory felt shallow. I heard about it, wanted to explore," he stammered, but his explanation felt weak, even to himself. "Do you really think it was your choice?" The question struck like thunder in his mind. He began to back away, his breaths coming shorter and faster. It couldn't be true. He had chosen to go there. It was his decision, his curiosity that had led him to open that book. "You chose nothing," the creature continued. You were drawn there, Lucas. From the moment you were born, your story was already written. Its words stirred a whirlwind of memories, fragments of forgotten dreams, whispers in moments of solitude, an inexplicable feeling that something had been watching him all his life. "That's a lie," he shouted, trying to convince himself. But the conviction in his voice was crumbling. "Accept the beginning, and perhaps you'll understand the end." The creature raised a long, pale hand, pointing toward the base of a tower. Lucas followed its gesture and noticed a book different from all the others, larger and older, bound in chains with a rusty lock sealing its cover. He knew, instinctively, that this was the true beginning. Without hesitation, he stepped closer. The chains seemed to pulse like living veins, but as his trembling hands touched them, they crumbled into ash. Carefully, he opened the book, his breath hitching as he turned the first page. The text was familiar, yet different. It was the same book he had read in the library at the start of all this, but now the words were sharper, clearer, as though they had been rewritten for him to understand. They narrated a moment he did not remember, a night when, as a child, Lucas had dreamed of the library. The boy walked among the shelves, his small hands brushing the books. He stopped in front of a heavy volume with his name etched on the cover. When he opened it, a promise was made. He would belong to the library. Always. The ground trembled beneath him. Lucas fell to his knees, staring at the words as buried memories surged back, overwhelming him like a tidal wave. He remembered the dream, opening that book as a child, hearing the voice that whispered to him in that fleeting moment. "One day, you will return to me." The creature laughed again, the sound echoing through the void. "Now you understand, Lucas. You didn't find the library. It has been waiting for you." Lucas slammed the book shut, as if trying to silence the truth. But it was too late. He knew what he was now. Not just a curious explorer, but part of the story, part of the library. "You are the beginning, Lucas." And the end. Lucas remained kneeling before the book, the creature's laughter ringing in his mind. He felt as though he were trapped in a whirlwind of emotions. Fear, anger, and a strange acceptance creeping into his thoughts. "The beginning and the end," he murmured, trying to make sense of the creature's words. "This doesn't have to end like this," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "But it already has," the creature replied, its voice laced with something that resembled pity. It gestured toward the tower of books, which began to shudder, its pages tearing free and spiraling through the air like a storm of memories. "You can fight, Lucas, but destiny is not something you can rewrite." Lucas felt a spark of anger ignite within him, a final flicker of resistance against the crushing darkness. He looked up at the creature, his eyes blazing with defiance. "If destiny cannot be rewritten," Lucas said, rising to his feet, "then I'll destroy it." Without hesitation, he grabbed a large book before him, the one containing the beginning of it all, and lifted it above his head. For the first time, the creature took a step back, its expression shifting to something resembling surprise. "You don't know what you're doing," it warned. "Maybe not," Lucas replied, "but if all I am is part of the story, then I'd rather it end now." With all his strength, he slammed the book against the ground. The impact was followed by a deafening roar, like a thunderclap that shook the very fabric of the space around him. The book's pages flew open, releasing a blinding golden light that surged outward in a powerful wave. The creature screamed, its form splintering into fragments of shadow. The towering stack of books began to collapse, each volume disintegrating into bursts of ash. Lucas felt the ground crumble beneath his feet, but made no attempt to hold on. He knew everything was coming to an end. When he opened his eyes again, he was back in the library. It looked as it had before, abandoned, dusty, with broken shelves and the musty scent of old paper filling the air. Lucas lay on the floor, his body heavy as though he had run for days. Slowly, he pushed himself up and glanced around. The magic was gone. The dark presence had vanished. The room where he had first found the book was now empty. He staggered out of the library, the morning sun casting its light over the quiet city. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if it had all been a dream, a hallucination. But when he looked down at his hand, he saw faint smudges of ash clinging to his palm. Lucas took a deep breath, knowing something fundamental had changed. The library would not call him back. He had destroyed the story, broken the cycle, and yet a lingering doubt gnawed at him. What if the true ending had yet to be written? He cast one last glance at the library before turning away and walking into the sunlight, unaware of the shadows that had begun to stir once more inside, waiting for the next visitor to write their chapter.